Welcome to another episode of our long and calming journey through boring history, where we dive deep into the past, not to excite you with fast thrills, but to let the steady rhythm of forgotten stories ease your mind and help you drift into peace. And if you truly enjoy these long storytelling sessions where history becomes your companion for rest and relaxation, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another chapter of our journey, because every click of support helps us bring you more of the content you love. And while you're here, I would love to know something from you. So tell me in the comments, from where in the world are you listening right now? And what time is it where you are? Because I find it fascinating to imagine people from different corners of the globe at different hours of the day or night, all connected through the simple act of sharing these stories. So let us know down below, and let's continue this journey together. In the stillness of a 14th century morning, when the faintest light begins to press against the wooden shutters of narrow houses, and the cool weight of night slowly releases its grip, the day does not awaken with brightness or cheer, but instead with a quiet heaviness that spreads through every lane and every dwelling. And in this quiet heaviness, life begins not with a sense of joy or excitement, but with a sense of continuation. Because in the era of the Black Death, each new morning is not a gift of opportunity, but a reminder of endurance. A reminder that the body must once again rise to meet the same tasks, the same sounds, the same slow unfolding of time. Inside the homes where families sleep, the air is thick with the smell of smoke that never truly fades. The remains of last night's fire lingering in the fibers of clothes, in the rough beams above, and in the uneven plaster of walls, a smell that mixes with the faint odor of damp straw, worn cloth, and too many bodies sharing too little space. And as eyes open to this familiar air, there is no sense of freshness, no sense of renewal, only the steady awareness that another day has arrived, whether it is welcomed or not. Families rise from straw beds that are flattened by long use, the husks inside crackling faintly as weight shifts, the coarse fabric coverings scratching against the skin, and the wool blankets, if such blankets are owned, are heavy, carrying with them the odors of smoke, sweat, and unwashed fibers. Yet they are precious because they hold back the chill of the night air. Children stir slowly, some coughing, some rubbing their eyes, while parents rise with a kind of quiet acceptance, not expecting comfort, not expecting ease, but knowing that movement must come because tasks wait outside and tasks do not wait. Kindly, the rooms where people wake are dim, the only light creeping in through small gaps where shutters do not close fully or where the walls are cracked. And this dimness shapes the morning, making shadows stretch softly, making each object blur slightly, as if the world itself hesitates to reveal too much at once. The soundscape of this morning is never silent, though it seems so at first. For if one listens carefully, there is always the faint scratch of a rat moving quickly along a wall or across the floor. There is the creak of beams adjusting to the cool air. There is the cough of a neighbor behind thin walls. And there is the hoarse cry of a rooster somewhere nearby. Not jubilant, not musical, but simply persistent, as if announcing the day out of duty more than joy. These sounds are not dramatic. They are not startling. But they remind each person that life stirs around them and that the rhythm of existence continues. To place one's feet on the floor in the morning is to feel the chill of packed earth or uneven stone rise immediately through the body, a cold that does not fade quickly, and shoes are not always waiting by the bed, for many go barefoot or wrap cloth around their feet, and so the first steps of the day carry discomfort before anything else. Clothing is pulled close, wool and linen that are stiff with wear, garments that rarely see washing because water is difficult to fetch and heat. Soap is costly and time is precious, so clothes are worn until they shape themselves to the body. until they carry the marks of labor and the scent of smoke as naturally as skin itself. The first actions of the day are quiet and methodical, for the fire must be coaxed from embers if embers remain, and this requires patience, a gentle blowing, a careful placing of dry twigs, the slow feeding of flame until it is strong enough to hold a pot or warm a room. Smoke curls upward into spaces that often lack proper chimneys, and so it lingers, blackening ceilings, stinging eyes, and settling into every surface. Yet this smoke is not resisted because it is necessary, because without it warmth is lost, and without it water cannot be boiled, and without it food cannot be prepared. Around this fire families gather, moving slowly, not with the rush of schedules, but with the heaviness of bodies that conserve their energy. 'Cause each action must be measured, each effort must be useful. Children sit close, rubbing their hands together, while parents add fuel, stir pots, or prepare bread. And the conversation that passes between them is minimal, hushed, and steady, not because there is secrecy, but because voices themselves are weary, and words are saved for when they are required. Beyond the walls of the home, the world is still subdued. The narrow lanes are quiet, the ground damp with dew or the residue of rain, and the air carries a coolness that will not last once the sun rises higher, but for now it lingers, giving the streets a kind of hushed stillness. Rats move across these lanes freely, darting into shadows, slipping between heaps of waste or under piles of wood. They are small movements, so common that they hardly draw attention, for they are part of the scenery, as much a presence as the stones of the road or the timber of the doors. The smell outside is not sharp in the morning, but it is layered, the faint rot of refuse, the smoke from hearths, the musk of animals, the dampness of earth. And though none of these scents are overwhelming, together they create a background that never disappears, a reminder that cleanliness is not part of life here, that the world is shared with decay as naturally as it is shared with breath. Each morning carries with it a shadow that cannot be ignored, even if it is not spoken aloud, and that shadow is the presence of sickness. For the Black Death has swept through towns and villages, leaving absence where families once were, leaving silence where voices once rose. And though a person might wake feeling strong, though a person might step into the day without cough or fever, there is no certainty that strength will remain, no certainty that health will last, because illness is not predictable and safety is not guaranteed. To wake in this time is to accept that life is fragile, and yet life continues, because there is no choice, because tasks must be done, as hunger waits for no one, because fires must be fed, because bread must be baked, because water must be drawn. And so the day begins, heavy but steady, carrying forward without question. The monotony of morning is both burden and comfort, for though it is wearisome to repeat the same actions endlessly, it is also reassuring to know that these actions remain, that in a world where sickness erases families and uncertainty looms, at every corner, the act of rising, of stirring embers, of preparing food, of stepping into the quiet street is something that continues, something that can be relied upon. And so morning stretches slowly, with the dimness of rooms and the coolness of air, with the silence of families moving softly and the faint scurrying of rats always near. And though the day has barely begun, its rhythm is already set, its pattern already formed, a pattern that repeats not just for one day, but for many, not just for one household, but for all, a pattern of endurance that defines life in the Black Death era, where survival is measured not in triumphs, not in moments of joy, but in the steady ability to rise again and again into the silence of morning, to face the same heaviness without resistance, and to continue forward, rat by rat, breath by breath, silence by silence. When the plague first arrived, It did not come as a roar, but as a whisper, a faint disturbance on the distant edge of daily life. A quiet rumor carried by sailors, merchants, and travelers who spoke of strange deaths in lands far away, of cities emptied overnight, of ships adrift with no living crew, and of a sickness that moved faster than reason and killed more swiftly than war. And though these early stories were often dismissed or softened by disbelief, by the natural human tendency to minimize what seems too distant to be real, the truth was that the world had already begun to shift long before most people realized it. In a sleep that had once offered a small daily comfort, a chance to escape the worries of daylight and the weight of labor was beginning to erode beneath the creeping anxiety that something terrible was coming. Something that did not care for station or status, for wealth or poverty, for cities or hamlets. And as 1347 turned to 1348, as the death ships arrived in Messina and then 2 other ports in the Mediterranean, that quiet dread began to settle in the hearts of people across Europe like a low fog, impossible to grasp but present in every silence, in every glance exchanged between neighbors. And it was in the nights, more than in the daylight, that this dread took root. For the darkness that once cloaked the familiar routines of shared sleep, the flicker of hearth light, the soft breaths of children nestled close, and the slow crackle of embers dying in the grate, now seemed to amplify the unknown, now echoed with unspoken fears. And sleep began to change, not all at once, not immediately, but gradually, as if the mind itself no longer trusted the body to surrender fully to rest, as if the soul felt that to fall asleep too deeply was to risk never waking again. For even before the plague reached the heartlands of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, even before the first pustules bloomed on skin and the first cart began to rattle through narrow streets with its grim cargo, the emotional weight of the coming catastrophe had begun to alter the landscape of rest, and people found themselves lying awake for longer than usual, staring into the dark, turning over the same thoughts again and again, wondering if they would be among the unlucky ones, wondering if the rumors were true that the plague could pass through breath, water, or even through thoughts. And though the knowledge of infection was crude and confused, the fear itself was sharp and precise, and it dug into the hours of the night with the persistence of a woodworm burrowing into a beam, quiet but destructive, relentless and deep. And as the first confirmed outbreaks began to erupt inland, as the deaths became impossible to deny, as the tolls of church bells began to blend together into a single mournful echo that seemed to stretch across entire counties, sleep ceased to be a retreat and became instead an anxious pause, a temporary escape that offered little real comfort. For even the act of lying down beside a loved one came with its own hidden terror. What if they coughed in the night? What if they moved strangely? What if their skin felt too hot or too cold? What if they did not wake? Or worse, what if they did and they were already dying, and so people lay awake longer, clinging to each other in crowded rooms that now felt not like havens, but like traps, places where air was thick and time moved slowly, where every shadow on the wall seemed more menacing, and even those who had never feared the night now began to dread it. For it was in the night that the symptoms often emerged, in the stillness that the body betrayed itself, in the silence that death slipped most easily into a household unnoticed until morning. And as days passed and the sick multiplied, homes changed their rules, and with them rituals of sleep. Some families began sleeping in shifts, one always waking while the others rested, in case someone stirred with fever or pain, in case something needed to be done, in case the cough began. And in monasteries where the ancient hours of prayer still rang out at midnight and dawn, the chants became slower, heavier, as monks began collapsing in their cells or failing to rise at all. and the echoing footsteps that once filled the halls with ordered purpose were now replaced by the dragging movements of the sick or the quiet murmurs of dying brothers. And even there, in those places dedicated to reflection and order, sleep was no longer what it had been, for the walls themselves began to hold the sound of breath slowing and stopping, of whispered prayers offered in trembling Latin, and in towns and villages. More changes followed. People began isolating the sick, in spare rooms, if they had them, or in barns or sheds if they did not, and the beds that had once held spouses, children, grandparents together now became dangerous. Each body a possible vessel of doom, and yet most had nowhere else to go, no space to separate themselves, and so sleep became layered with guilt and fear. And the very touch of a shared blanket or the exhalation of a sleeping companion could bring with it unbearable anxiety. And in those nights, dreams too began to change before the plague. Dreams had been strange, sometimes divine, sometimes troubling, but often rooted in familiar symbols, saints, lost relatives. But now, dreams became darker, filled with images of fire, of burial, of falling, of choking, of being left behind. And these dreams, when remembered, were spoken of less and less, for to share them was to make them real, and silence became a shield against despair. And still, people tried to preserve some pattern, some normality in the face of this shifting terror. Still, they lit their candles before bed. Still, they prayed. Still, they mumbled the old blessings and laid their heads on the same sacks of straw, hoping for peace, hoping to wake, hoping not to dream at all. And still, the plague moved forward, unhurried, indiscriminate, unrelenting, and in the homes of the wealthy, even the silken sheets and well-tended mattresses offered no true protection, for though they had space and servants, and access to physicians who prescribed all manner of useless remedies from crushed emeralds to bloodletting to poultices of vinegar and roses, the disease did not care. And so even the fine homes became haunted places, their beds becoming deathbeds, their nurseries becoming tombs. And still the night stretched on, longer than before, or so it felt, heavier than it had ever been. And in places where whole families had died, homes stood silent, their doors marked with crude symbols or left swinging open in the wind. And sometimes the only sound in the night was the distant clatter of a cart, the soft sob of someone still alive, the rustle of rats in the thatch, or the eerie quiet of a town too emptied to dream any more. And it is in this new night, this strange, altered space of restlessness and grief, that we begin to understand what it meant to sleep during the Black Death, not merely to lie down and close one's eyes, to hover on the edge of unconsciousness, always listening, always fearing, always holding on to the fragile hope that morning might still come, that breath might still be drawn, that the fever might pass by this house and find another. And yet, even as people feared the night, they still needed it, still sought its small comforts, for no one can remain fully awake forever. And even in the depths of plague, sleep came sometimes gently, sometimes with tears, sometimes with surrender, sometimes with the last breath, and for those who survive, to yet another day, sleep became both a victory and a torment, a necessary pause in a world that had lost its rhythm, a moment of stillness in a world now overtaken by sorrow. And so the beds remained filled, the blankets still pulled close, the candles still lit before they were blown out, and people still prayed, not because they believed it would surely save them, but because there was nothing else to do, no other comfort to hold on to, no other habit strong enough to survive the collapse of everything else. And so sleep persisted, broken though it was, changed though it had become, 'cause even in the worst of times, the body demands rest, and the soul, however frightened, still longs for peace. as the Black Death crept deeper into the hearts of towns and the hollows of distant villages, as it wove itself into every household like smoke through an open window, as it turned homes into places of quiet horror and sleep into something dangerous and unfamiliar. It became increasingly difficult for those still living to find even the smallest measure of peace in the hours of night, and even more so for those who found themselves in the presence of the sick, for in the confined spaces where illness took hold, sleep was no longer merely a pause in the day, no longer a gentle descent into restfulness, but something strained and shadowed, something that hovered between relief and resignation. For it was inside the walls of these afflicted homes where the fear of sleep became most pronounced, where rest came not with comfort, but with guilt, not with safety, but with suspicion. For in rooms where someone had already begun to show signs of the pestilence, in places where a father or a mother had developed a swelling beneath the arms, or a dark blotch on the leg, where a child lay fevered and shaking beneath damp cloth, the act of sleeping became a choice haunted by dread. And yet, even so, the body still needed to sleep, still collapsed when it could no longer stay upright. And this led to an uneasy rhythm in which sleep and suffering coexisted, not as peaceful companions, but as reluctant neighbors forced to share the same narrow space. And so the sick and the not yet sick and the maybe sick and the silently dreading all found themselves confined to the same beds, the same rooms, the same breaths, and within these walls, time itself seemed to warp. For the usual patterns of work and prayer and daylight no longer applied, and instead, life moved in cycles of fever, moaning, sweating, silence, crying, praying, and eventually, stillness. And in such places, sleep came not when the sun went down, but when the body failed, when exhaustion overtook the watchfulness of fear, and often it came in short, shallow bursts, interrupted by coughing, by the muttering of the dying, by the opening of a door as someone left in search of a priest or a bucket of water or someone to help carry a body away. And as the number of sick grew, the beds that once held family members now became overcrowded with the weight of death. And when one person died in the night, there was often nowhere else to put the body, so they were left where they were, their faces covered with linen or sackcloth, their limbs stiffening beside those who still clung to life. And so people slept beside the dead, not because they wished to, but because there was no other space, no other choice. And in those moments, sleep took on an entirely new shape, which was no longer merely a risk, but a surrender, a reluctant giving over of the senses in full knowledge that waking might never come, or if it did, that waking would mean returning to a room more silent than before, more emptied of breath, more hollow in its sound. And so sleep was no longer about rest, but about escape, about stepping away for a few hours from a world that no longer made sense, from a reality in which the line between living and dying was too thin to see and too painful to face. And this was the new nightly ritual in the homes of the Sika, ritual marked not by the quieting of the day or the soothing patterns of bedtime routines, but by uncertainty, by whispered fears, by the constant rechecking of pulses and temperatures, by the rustling of blankets pulled up higher in the hopes of warding off what felt like an inevitable fate. And many tried to protect themselves as best they could within these walls, stuffing their nostrils with strong herbs like rosemary or thyme, burning sage or juniper in small pots near their beds, hoping the scent might purify the air and protect their lungs. And others tied cloth around their faces or placed icons and crosses beside their pillows, convinced that prayer and purity might be enough to repel the sickness. But none of these things brought true comfort, and the sleep that followed was not deep or healing, but rather shallow, anxious, filled with disturbed dreams and half-waking fears. And sometimes people woke in the night, not knowing if they were ill or simply tired, unsure if the ache in their joints was a sign or just a weight of fear settling deeper into their bones. And in this way, the bedroom, the most personal space in the medieval home, became a place of ambiguity. No longer a refuge, but a battlefield, a place where one fought against both infection and despair. And many chose to separate themselves if they could, sending the ill to sleep alone or together in a different room, or moving into barns or attics to rest away from those who showed signs. But more often than not, such separation was impossible, for the poor did not have extra rooms, and many households consisted of only one or two enclosed spaces. And so the sick remained among the well, and the well slept with one eye open, listening for every breath, every movement, every sigh. And the presence of the sick body beside you became its own form of torment, not because of revulsion or cruelty, but because of love, because to sleep next to someone you cared for, while knowing they were dying and that you might follow them soon, was an emotional weight that changed sleep forever. Turning it from something you shared to something you endured. And even when death finally came, it did not end the disruption of sleep, but deepened it. For the removal of bodies was delayed. Carts arrived only when they could, and until then, dead remained where they had fallen, and the living had no choice but to remain beside them, to lie down again in the same room, the same bed, the same space where someone had breathed their last just hours before. And many slept with cloth over their faces, or turned to the wall, or kept a candle burning through the night, to keep the darkness from swallowing them entirely. And still, despite all this, people sought rest, not because they believed it was safe, but because the weight of constant wakefulness could not be sustained. And there are accounts, scattered through letters and chronicles and second-hand memories, of people weeping before bed, not because they were afraid of dying in their sleep, but because they feared waking to a house more empty than it had been the night before. And this became the nightly rhythm in the homes of the sicker rhythm, of dread, of love held tightly in fear, of silence broken only by coughing and prayers, of beds too crowded and air too still, of dreams too vivid and mornings too uncertain. And when people did dream, they dreamed of better days, of green fields, of feast days, of music, of the laughter of friends who were now gone. Some dreamed of being pursued, of fleeing through narrow alleys or darkened churches, of hiding in towers, of being unable to cry out as something unseen drew near. And these dreams became part of the collective memory of the plague, remembered not because they were prophetic, but because they revealed what could not be spoken in waking hours, the deep and constant fear that even love could not protect, that even faith might not be enough, and that sleep, once a simple part of the human routine, was now a kind of gamble. And for those who survived, who slept through it and woke again, and kept waking for days and weeks and months, the memory of sleeping in the house of the sick did not leave them quickly, did not soften with time, for it left behind a trace of feeling, reflexive tension in the limbs whenever sleep approached, a flicker of guilt or worry in the moments before closing one's eyes, and even long after the plague passed, when the beds were no longer shared with the dying, when the carts no longer rolled through the streets at dawn, when prayers no longer trembled with desperation. Many still carried with them the fear of rest, the memory of what it meant to lie down next to someone and wonder if they or you would wake again. And so sleep during the plague was not simply interrupted by grief or changed by circumstance, but deeply altered by proximity to death. And in the homes of the sick, where love could not shield the healthy from harm and faith could not raise the dying from their beds, sleep was transformed into something slower, more fragile, more uncertain, and it remained that way for those who lived. Long after the candles had burned down and the windows were opened again, long after the scent of fever faded from the blankets and the house grew quiet for different reasons. For memory does not forget so easily. In sleep, once disturbed by such sorrow, does not return unchanged. In the long shadows cast by the flickering flame of a low-burning tallow candle, the medieval world during the time of the Black Death found itself suspended between silence and dread. And nowhere was this more intimately felt than in the shared spaces where ordinary people laid their heads to rest. These were not grand halls or private bedchambers for most folk, but rather modest, dimly lit rooms with low ceilings, earthen floors, and the smell of smoke and damp wool clinging to every timber beam and coarse linen sheet. The average dwelling in a 14th century town or village was often one room shared by the entire household, and even that one room may have doubled as the place for cooking, weaving, repairing tools, nursing the sick, and sometimes even stabling a goat or a few hens when winter pressed in tightly from all sides. At night, with the door barred shut, more to keep out wandering dogs and cold gusts than any true sense of safety, these families would gather close, not just for warmth, but also for the fragile comfort of familiar breath and shared fear. The concept of sleep itself was different, fragmented, unpredictable, and often restless. People slept not in a luxurious, unbroken stretch, but in phases, known now to historians as segmented sleep. One part would come shortly after sundown, when labor-wearied bodies collapsed in exhaustion. And then, some hours later, there would be a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, used for prayer, quiet conversation, tending to a child, checking on livestock, or simply listening to the wind against the shuttered wooden slats. Then, in the dark hours before dawn, they would return to what was known as the second sleep. But during the years of the plague, this fragile rhythm was further fractured by the presence of a hovering terror, made each cough a source of tension and every restless motion under a blanket a possible omen of disease. In urban centers, where families were crammed into tiny tenements, or in rural cottages built of wattle and daub, the idea of sleeping separately was as foreign as the plague itself had once been. Children, grandparents, and parents shared beds, often a straw mattress on the floor, sometimes lifted onto wooden slats or ropes if fortune allowed. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, rushes, or hay, and those with more means might line theirs with feathers or wool. But even these offered little comfort when illness was in the house. If one member began to show signs of the Black Death, as sudden fever, swelling, or blood-specked, coughed, the shared sleeping space turned from haven to threat in a breath. And yet, families rarely separated the sick from the well. There were no spare rooms to send someone off to, no clean wards, no isolation protocols as we would understand them. Instead, love mingled with inevitability, and many continued to lie beside their loved ones even as they deteriorated, holding hands, offering cool cloths to sweaty foreheads, and whispering prayers until the end came. These were not grand, dramatic moments, but quiet, heartbreaking ones in the stillness of night, when a child might realize their mother's breathing had stopped, or a husband might shift in the dark and feel the weight beside him unnaturally still. Fear permeated every corner of these sleeping quarters, and yet people still tried to rest. Sleep was not a luxury, but a necessity, something the body demanded, no matter how much the mind resisted. And so, the sick slept fitfully, tossing between fever and chills, their dreams slipping into nightmares shaped by the pain in their bodies. The healthier, those not yet sick, tried to find some measure of peace beneath threadbare blankets, whispering Hail Marys, listening to the distant bells tolling for yet another soul, and wondering whether they, too, would live to see the sunrise. The air in these rooms was thick with moisture, breath, and sometimes the acrid scent of vinegar or burning herbs, desperate attempts to purify the air and keep the pestilence at bay. Lavender, rosemary, and sage might be burned near the hearth, the smoke curling up toward the ceiling beams blackened with soot and time. Some hung posies or pomanders above their beds, tiny bundles of sweet-smelling herbs thought to fend off the miasmas believed to carry the plague. Others clutched talismans in their sleep, small wooden crosses or relics of saints, hoping their faith might offer a shield no doctor could provide. But there was little hope in these shared spaces, only endurance. The rhythm of the household changed as sleep became less about comfort and more about survival. Parents sat up through the night, watching over their children, not daring to drift into slumber in case the child's breathing altered. In monastic dormitories, where rows of beds once symbolized order and devotion, monks now lay coughing, whispering prayers together when they could muster the strength, their chants fading into uneasy silence. In inns and hostels, travelers slept, warily, with their cloaks pulled tightly around them and one eye open toward the door, wondering if the stranger in the next bedroll carried death with him. Even the wealthy, though protected by thicker walls and separate rooms, found little relief. Servants would come and go in the night with basins, cloths, and whispered reports of worsening symptoms. Noble women, who once lay in feather beds now, pulled scarves over their faces and waited for signs of illness in their children. And outside the walls of these homes, the streets remained eerily still, especially at night, when only the occasional wheelbarrow or soft footsteps of the dead cart passed beneath shuttered windows. The city slept uneasily, and the countryside fared no better. In thatched cottages, nestled beside fields, families huddled together more tightly than ever, times 6 or more to a bed, sharing their body heat and their fate. They whispered stories to calm the youngest, hummed lullabies in the dark, and tried to keep one another grounded in memory and hope. Sleep became a momentary escape from a waking world too painful to bear. But it was never without danger, for, even in dreams, the reality of plague invaded. People dreamt of shadowy figures in bird-like masks, of endless funerals, of mothers weeping beside empty cradles, of wolves howling just beyond the hedgerow. And when morning came, if it came, they rose slowly, stiff from cold, backs sore from straw pallets, eyes hollow from another night of worry. Sleep, in the time of the Black Death, was no longer merely rested, was a nightly act of courage, of surrender to the unknown, and of clinging to the warmth of another human beside you, even when you knew that warmth might vanish before the next dusk. It was shared not only in space but in spirit, a collective endurance quietly carried out in the darkness by people who had little else but one another, in the hope that somehow, by morning, they might still be breathing, still alive, and still dreaming of better days. During the years when the plague quietly threaded its way through cobbled lanes and wooden doors, the sky seemed permanently heavy with sorrow, and the breath of the cities grew thick with both incense and the scent of lie. Sleeping became something altogether more mysterious, subdued, and distant from comfort. For to lie down in such times was no longer merely a retreat from the day's labor or a restoration of the body, but often a silent agreement with the unknown, a vulnerable surrender to what might await upon waking, if waking ever came at all. And it is in this unsettling atmosphere that we must pause and consider the various spaces in which people found rest, or the imitation of rest, some modest, some makeshift, some communal, some solitary, all heavy with the weight of a world unraveling. And yet, remarkably, people continued to sleep, not out of ignorance or bravado, but out of necessity. For even in the darkest hours, the human need for slumber remained, and within that slumber, perhaps a small shard of peace, even if fleeting, could still be grasped. And as we slowly unravel the texture of that night-bound world, we begin by entering the homes of the peasantry, who formed the great majority of Europe's population during the 14th century, and who, more than any other group, bore the bluntest edges of suffering without ceremony or reprieve. For their homes were typically one-room dwellings, made of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs that often leaked, and floors that were bare earth or roughly layered with rushes and straw, replaced infrequently and crawling with lice and other small intrusions of the natural world. And though these spaces were humble and porous, they were at least familiar, and it was within them that families, sometimes numbering 5 or 6 or more, gathered at night to sleep side by side, not out of closeness or preference necessarily, but out of practical necessity and the simple truth that warmth was more easily retained in shared bodily proximity, particularly during the long, damp winters when firewood was precious and the chill refused to lift. And these families would lay themselves down upon mattresses if they had them, often sacks filled with straw or heather or reeds, sometimes softened with wool if fortune allowed, and covered with blankets spun from coarse wool, sometimes patched and fraying, but nevertheless treasured. And as the night unfolded and silence fell across the countryside, the sounds of sleep would mingle with the groaning of timber frames and the distant howling of wind through trees, and, perhaps for a few hours, the anxieties of sickness, of failing crops, and of unseen dangers might be held at bay, though rarely for long. And in towns and cities, where the closeness of dwellings and the density of bodies fostered faster spread of plague and panic, the sleeping arrangements were varied, but no less fraught, as apprentices and laborers often lived with their masters or in dormitory-style housing, sleeping in rows or pairs, sometimes on pallets, sometimes directly upon the floor, depending on status and wealth, and the line between work and rest was faint, as many slept in the very rooms where they toiled, their slumber permeated by the scent of leather if they were cobblers, of flour if they were bakers, of iron and soot if they were smiths. And in wealthier households, the story was slightly different, but not devoid of anxiety, for while beds were larger and finer, some even boasting carved posts and canopies, with feather mattresses and linen sheets, the fear of illness lingered just as sharply, and the quiet dread that one might not awaken was known across every social boundary, and so bedrooms were often fumigated with herbs, lavender and rosemary, juniper and wormwood, their scent not only a token of cleanliness, but a spiritual shield of sorts, and some even burned bundles of these herbs in small braziers near the bed, the smoke curling upward toward the beams and lingering like a prayer offered to the night. And as people lay down to rest, whether in grandeur or poverty, they often did so after long and elaborate routines of prayer, for religion was not simply a daily habit, but a framework for interpreting the chaos of disease, and sleep, which hovered between waking life and death, was considered a time when the soul might wander, and thus required protection, not only from physical dangers, but from spiritual ones. So nightly prayers included not only petitions for safety, but also acts of contrition, and in some cases charms were hung near the bed, or psalms written on scraps of parchment were tucked beneath pillows to ward off spirits. And if one was ill, family members or caretakers might sit nearby through the night, keeping vigil with damp cloths, murmured prayers, or silence, for sleep and death resembled one another too closely to be ignored. And sometimes, in more extreme cases, entire households would sleep together in a single room, regardless of status, whether out of fear or necessity, for the normal boundaries of domestic space dissolved in the face of illness, and those fortunate enough to be uninfected might sleep with one eye open, so to speak, ears alert for the slightest cough or groan, and in some towns, makeshift hospitals or plague houses were established where the sick were kept separate from the healthy, and here too, sleep was a rare and uneasy guest for attendants, wore beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, and rarely lingered near the beds, while the afflicted often lay alone under rough blankets on crude bedding, their dreams fragmented by fever. And even the monasteries, those bastions of regulated rest, altered their sleeping arrangements. As monks who once slept side by side in dormitories began to sleep in isolation if possible, separating cots by greater distances or creating partitions from cloth. And still, the routine of prayer in the middle of the night continued, for the monastic hours did not pause for plague, though the voices chanting matins in the pre-dawn hours were often thinner, quieter, and laced with mourning. And across all these varied spaces, huts, halls, convents, hovels, and hospitals, one might say that sleep persisted, not because it was welcome or restful, but because it was inevitable. And even in the midst of death, the human body required rest, and though it might be uneasy, disturbed by coughing or nightmares or the distant ringing of a bell signaling another death, it still arrived each night with the fading of the sun and cloaked the world in a strange hush. And for a few hours, the living withdrew from their waking troubles, surrendering to a sleep shaped by fear, tradition, habit, and above all, the quiet endurance of people who, in spite of all, continue to lie down each night, sometimes with family, sometimes alone, sometimes in beds, sometimes on the floor, in houses, barns, sheds, or under the stars, not because they had faith in tomorrow, but because the body, exhausted by worry and work, by grief and hunger, by hope and the weight of uncertainty, could not do otherwise, and in that surrender, there was something human and humble and deeply recognizable, for while the world beyond the walls might have changed, while sickness might stalk the lanes and sorrow haunt every doorstep, the act of sleeping, curling up into darkness, closing one's eyes, waiting for morning remained one of the last ordinary things that people could hold on to, a gesture that quietly whispered of continuity, of resilience, and of the small, consistent rhythm of life amid the great silence of the plague. During the long and anxious nights of the Black Death, when plague carts rumbled slowly down narrow lanes and the cry of "Bring out your dead" became a cruel part of the daily rhythm, the notion of sleeps, something once simple and taken for granted, shifted into something far more complex and uneasy, 'cause as much as the body longed for rest, the mind could scarcely grant it, and the soul, tangled in fear and superstition, often wandered too restlessly to allow the eyes to close for long. And so, in towns large and small, from London to Lyon, sleep itself became something of a ritual, a cautious descent into vulnerability, one that people navigated with care, hesitation, and an ever-present awareness that they might not awaken with the dawn. For to fall asleep during such a time was not simply to recharge the body, was to risk never rising again, as the illness so often struck in the early hours, stealing breath from slumbering lungs before one even had a chance to scream. And this quiet dread filtered into every detail of how people tried to rest, whether they were wealthy enough to lie on feather-stuffed mattresses behind shuttered windows, or poor enough to share straw pallets on dirt floors with family, neighbors, and sometimes rats. And though these beds differed in comfort, all who lay down on them did so with one common weight, pressing heavily on their chests the knowledge that death was in the air, perhaps already in their blood. For the plague had no regard for class, no sympathy for youth, and no pattern that could be trusted long enough to offer true comfort. And so people adapted, not only in their waking lives, but in the quiet, dim hours before sleep, lighting candles, even when oil was scarce, hanging religious charms and amulets above their beds, whispering prayers and incantations to ward off evil spirits, and watching for signs, however faint, that sickness was creeping into their homes. Whether it was a dry cough, a flushed cheek, or the appearance of the dreaded buboes. And yet, despite the fear, the body still demanded sleep, and so rituals were formed to try and coax it safely, even in times of chaos, with some turning to strong herbal remedies like poppy syrup or infusions of valerian, hyssop, and chamomile, hoping to lull their senses gently rather than drink themselves senseless with cheap ale or wine. And in some towns, local apothecaries crafted sleeping draughts so potent that they bordered on narcotic, a tempting yet risky option for those desperate to escape reality for a few short hours, while others, distrustful of medicine or simply too poor to afford it, instead relied on rhythm and repetition, rocking infants in cradles hung from ceiling beams, humming low melodies, or reciting psalms aloud in the hopes that the rhythm of words would smooth the mind into quiet. Though even then, sleep was often broken by distant wailing, the sound of a bell tolling too frequently, or the groan of a neighbor who had taken ill in the night. And for those who lived in the countryside, far from town, their fears were no less, only different in shape and sound, with the eerie silence of the woods broken not by carts, but by wolves, owls, and the howl of cold winds creeping under doorways. And many rural families, lacking knowledge of the disease's spread, turned instead to folklore, nailing horseshoes to their doorposts, laying iron near their beds, or hanging dried bundles of garlic and rosemary in the rafters to repel evil spirits. And some even placed bowls of vinegar beneath their beds, believing the vapors might purify the air as they slept, though few truly knew whether such measures worked, only that doing anything felt better than surrendering to helplessness. And so their sleep became a negotiated truce between exhaustion and anxiety, with one eye often half open, listening for changes in breathing, in footsteps, or in the unsettling stillness that sometimes fell when death arrived quietly. And even in monasteries, where routine was sacred and prayer constant, the monks found their sleep shortened and disturbed, for they too fell ill in numbers. Their dormitories, once filled with gentle snores, now echoing with coughs. And even the act of lying down was steeped in uncertainty, for many believed that sleeping on one's back might allow death to settle more easily into the lungs. So people turned to their sides, curling tight like children, hands clasped in prayer beneath thin blankets. And when they did fall asleep, dreams became darker, more vivid, filled with symbols of decay, fire, blood, and the looming figures of death and angels. And some who survived the plague later recounted dreams that foretold their loved ones, deaths or visions of strange figures, cloaked and faceless, who stood silently by their beds and vanished before morning. And whether these dreams were shaped by fever, imagination, or something else entirely, they left deep marks on the minds of the living, influencing not just sleep, but waking belief. And it was during this time that the boundary between sleep and death blurred, not only in a spiritual sense, but in a practical one, for many died in their sleep, never knowing they were ill, while others were buried hastily before they had truly passed. And this fear of being mistaken for dead led some to sleep with bells tied around their wrists or fingers, crude but hopeful alarms that might sound if they stirred in their coffins. And though rare, such stories fed the unease that already haunted every nighttime moment. And in cities where the sick were quarantined in homes or locked into pest houses, sleep took on a new kind of loneliness, as those infected were often left without comfort, their families barred from entering, their food passed through slits in the doors. And though they might have once shared a bed or a room with loved ones, now they lay alone, feverish and afraid, the darkness around them offering no peace, only isolation. And even those who weren't sick lived under strict curfews, the night hours patrolled by guards, and windows shuttered tight against the miasma, with many believing that the plague floated thickest in the air after sundown. So even fresh air was seen as suspect, and rooms became stifling, lit dimly by flickering candles or left in darkness entirely, with people often sleeping in their clothes for warmth, or keeping a packed bag nearby in case they needed to flee in the night, and in homes with more than one floor. The sick were sometimes kept in the upper rooms, while the healthy tried to sleep below, separated by nothing more than wood and prayers. And in such circumstances, every cough overhead felt like a drumbeat of doom, every floorboard creak a whisper of contagion descending. And so sleep was fragmented, broken into anxious dozing and sudden starts. And in many cases, people chose not to sleep at all, pacing through the night or sitting by their hearths, watching the embers glow and listening to the wind, counting rosary beads or rereading familiar scriptures by firelight, not for insight, but for the comfort of repetition, the illusion that if they just kept doing anything, they might keep death at bay. And among the wealthy, the fear was no less pronounced, though their homes were larger and their beds softer, for their physicians often brought more questions than answers, and their isolation could be even more complete, as servants died or fled, leaving them to tend to themselves. And in such silence, the mind played cruel tricks, amplifying each ache or chill until it felt like the plague itself had arrived. And so they too found sleep elusive, their dreams haunted not only by death, but by guilt, regret, and the weight of all they could not control. And across all walks of life, this shared exhaustion created a strange kind of unity, one not born of hope, but of fatigue, as people stumbled through their days, bleary-eyed and slow-moving, whispering of dreams, signs, and omens, and measuring their lives, not in days or weeks, but in nights survived. And slowly, as the plague rose and fell, as waves of death gave way to silence, and silence to cautious hope, people began to reclaim sleep. Not all at once, and not easily, but gradually, with the return of songs, laughter, and the simple comfort of undisturbed rest. And though the memory of those sleepless nights never truly faded, it softened, becoming part of the fabric of their stories, passed down as lessons, warnings, and reminders that even in the darkest times, the body still seeks peace, and sleep, though often feared, remains one of our most human needs, as essential as breath, as elusive as dreams, and as sacred as prayer. As the Black Death swept through medieval Europe, it did more than darken the daylight and filled the air with the scent of decay, crept silently into the night, changing not only how people lived and died, but also how they dreamed or struggled. To dream when the sun disappeared behind soot-colored skies, and sleep, which once offered respite and renewal, became something far more fragile, elusive, and fraught with unease. It was in the hours between dusk and dawn that the fears born of daylight truly took root. And for those who endured the ravages of the plague weather, they lived in crumbling city homes with shuttered windows, or in thatched cottages, where the only warmth came from the breath of livestock sleeping nearby. There was little comfort to be found in sleep, and much more terror in its pursuit, for to close one's eyes in such a time was to risk never opening them again, a truth that settled heavy upon the hearts of the afflicted and the unscathed alike. Nightly routines shifted slowly and without fanfare, into something unfamiliar and darkly shaped by grief, superstition, and the knowing awareness that death could come quietly in the night, without warning, without mercy, and often without a soul nearby to notice. For those fortunate enough to have loved ones still living beneath the same roof, sleeping arrangements became more than a matter of comfort or custom. They became spiritual battlegrounds, moral dilemmas, and logistical challenges, as the proximity of another person could mean solace, or it could mean exposure to the disease. And so the old customs of communal sleeping began to waver, even collapse, under the weight of uncertainty. And many who once shared straw pallets or crowded beds now slept apart, sometimes in separate corners of the same room, sometimes in entirely different buildings if space allowed, while others, desperate for connection and terrified of dying alone, defied the warnings and sought comfort in the warmth of others, even knowing it might be their final embrace. Priests and physicians, such as they were, offered conflicting advice. some urging separation, others urging prayer, but most merely shaking their heads in exhaustion. For they too were overwhelmed and dying in droves, and the night offered them no more clarity than it did the laborers, mothers, children, or monks who tossed and turned with eyes wide in the dark. The rhythms of the night, once shaped by church bells, cockcrows, the quiet movements of neighbors, grew strange and uneven during the plague year's bells now tolled not for prayer, but for death, and the silence that followed was not peaceful, but suffocating, broken only by the groans of the sick or the distant creak of plague carts rolling across cobbled lanes. Inside the home, the bed once a symbol of rest, family, and even status lost its comfort, its charm, its security, and instead became a place associated with isolation, fear, and finality. For the bed was now where many met their end, shivering in fevered sweat or slipping into unconsciousness while loved ones watched, unable to touch or console, lest they too fall victim to the invisible pestilence. Some families went so far as to remove the bedding altogether, stripping down mattresses to straw or even abandoning them entirely in favor of sleeping on floors or in barns, believing the disease clung to linen and wool as easily as it did to skin, and in truth, they were not entirely wrong, though they did not know of fleas or the bacteria that lived within them. They had observed enough to know that death lingered longest in close quarters, in still air, and in places where warmth and breath gathered. In this way, the very architecture of sleep began to shift. Once cozy and full of snoring children or whispering elders became eerie and empty, or overcrowded with those who could not bear to be alone, and the darkness itself seemed to press more heavily against windows and doors, as if mourning the vanished laughter and quiet breathing that once filled the night air. Even dreams were not spared. Those lucky enough to find slumber reported visions steeped in fire and shadow, visits from the dead, or strange, symbolic imagery that left them waking in tears or gasping for air. And while dreams had always been given weight in medieval society, often interpreted as omens or divine messages, now they were feared and mistrusted, as if the plague had poisoned not just bodies, but also the realm of sleep itself. Among the learned and the devout, sleep became a site of ritual and prayer, with some reciting litanies before bed, others sprinkling holy water upon their pillows, and still others placing religious relics or talismans beneath their beds to ward off evil spirits or misfortunate. None of these efforts offered much true comfort, and many fell asleep, knowing they might not live to see the sun rise again, especially if a new sore had appeared on their neck or armpit that day, or if they had coughed blood into their handkerchief that afternoon. For those who remained healthy, the guilt of sleep became a strange and heavy burden. How could one allow the mind to drift into dreams when others were dying so nearby? When the neighbor's home was now silent, or when the churchyard filled with fresh graves each morning. And so some resisted sleep altogether, pacing through the night, mumbling prayers or weeping softly into cloaks and shawls, hoping that wakefulness might serve as protection, that constant awareness might keep death at bay, though, of course, it could not, and fatigue eventually overcame even the strongest of wills. In some towns, people lit candles throughout the night, not for reading or work, but to chase away the darkness itself, to keep the shadows at bay, as if the plague might be fooled into thinking no one inside was asleep, and therefore no one was vulnerable. In others, midnight was a time for whispered song or the quiet brushing of hair, gentle rituals passed down through generations, now performed in near silence, not for vanity or beauty, but as a tether to the world before the sickness, a reminder of humanity amid the horror. And still, there were those who embraced sleep with resignation, who lay down each night in the same position, hands folded, eyes closed, as if already preparing for the grave. their minds no longer frantic, but numbed by grief, their hearts hollowed by too much loss. And for them, sleep was not an escape or a rest, it was a soft rehearsal for the stillness to come. And whether they woke again or not seemed less important than whether they could find peace, even fleetingly, within the arms of slumber. Children, especially, were hardest to comfort, for they sensed the fear in their parents' eyes, the changed tone in their lullabies, the way doors now stayed shut and games were no longer played, and many cried themselves to sleep or lay awake in frightened silence, their bodies small beneath oversized blankets, unsure of why everything had changed, but certain that something was very wrong. In some families, sleep became communal again, out of tradition or scarcity, but out of shared fear, as parents pulled children into their beds, or siblings huddled together in corners, not knowing whether it would be the last night they would do so. And in these moments, sleep carried the weight of memory and farewell, a quiet intimacy charged with unspoken dread. For the elderly, who had seen other fevers, other bad harvests, perhaps even earlier outbreaks, the fear was often less vivid, but no less real. They approached sleep with a kind of weary acceptance, having buried too many loved ones to fight the inevitable, and many simply lay down with a whispered prayer, not expecting to rise again, but not fearing it either. And so the night, once a time of renewal and gentle stillness, became something heavier, slower, more somber. And while sleep still came to some, it no longer offered the same nourishment or restoration, for it was now filtered through the lens of plague, through the uncertainty of survival, and through the aching void left by the dead whose dreams had ended mid-thought, mid-song, mid-sigh, in beds no longer warm and rooms no longer lit with laughter. The rhythms of sleep in the age of the Black Death were not uniform, but scattered, shaped by fear, custom, grief, and faith. And while some clung to old rituals in hopes they might ward off the worst, others abandoned all structure, sleeping at odd hours whenever exhaustion overcame them, sometimes not in beds at all, but in church pews, in fields, in barns, or beside the dying, spent to return to their own homes, too heartbroken to care whether they woke again themselves. And in this way, night after night, the landscape of sleep was redrawn by the invisible hand of pestilence. And those who lived through it carried these altered patterns forward, shaping how generations to come would view the sanctity, the vulnerability, and the strange mercy of sleep in a world forever changed by the shadow of the plague. As the Black Death continued its relentless grip across the towns and countrysides of Europe, there emerged subtle, silent transformations in the way people understood time, space, and the stillness of sleep, particularly in the rural landscapes that lay beyond the gates of plague-ravaged cities. In those hamlets and scattered villages where the pealing of bells was not a background sound, but an event in itself, and where the rhythms of life were intimately tied to the rhythms of the land, the weather, the seasons, and the slow procession of stars overhead. And it is here, in these quieter, more isolated corners of the world, that one begins to observe the way the plague altered not only routines of waking and sleeping, but also the very atmosphere in which rest occurred. For in these rustic settings, the absence of constant noise and the slower tempo of life made the presence of death seem even more pronounced, like a sudden storm over still water. And yet, for many of these villagers, the plague felt both far away and intimately close, as though the stories came before the sickness, and the dread was planted before the pestilence bloomed. And so it was in these rural homes built of timber and daub, roofed with thatch, walls hung with garlic, and hope where sleep was often a communal act, with families and even animals sharing warmth in a single room, that the fragility of human rest became even more apparent, because in such small households, word of illness spread quickly, in the moment someone coughed too deeply, or grew pale, or failed to rise at dawn with the others. The entire home was transformed into a space of whispered prayers, subtle glances, and an unspoken preparation for the worst. And in such cases, sleep took on the hue of waiting, not rest, a kind of breathless pause in a long uncertainty. For the rural poor lacked physicians, lacked remedies, and lacked anything but folk wisdom and ritual when it came to confronting disease. And so their nightfall was filled with both the soft hush of animal breathing and the weight of unanswered questions. And as the sun fell, and the candle was snuffed, and the hearth dimmed to embers, each sleeper turned inward, eyes closed against the darkness, hoping to wake, unsure they would. And in these shared spaces, where siblings clung to siblings and children slept pressed against parents, the line between dreams and fears blurred, and the sounds of the night and owl's cry, the rustle of wind through the thatch, the shifting of a body nearby could stir anxiety as easily as comfort. And when a neighboring village fell ill, or when a wandering monk passed through with warnings, the sleep that followed was often shallower, more interrupted, more shadowed by thoughts of what might come. And yet, people still worked their fields by day, mended their fences, baked their bread, because the rural economy, fragile as it was, could not pause for fear, and the body demanded sleep after labor, even if that sleep was uneasy. And here, one might pause to consider how deeply intertwined the physical exhaustion of daily toil was with the capacity to sleep through fear. For a man who had dug ditches or herded animals from dawn until dusk might collapse into sleep, regardless of the thoughts that haunted him. And so, in many homes, the act of sleep became an act of resistance, of necessity, of surrender. And though the rituals were simple, perhaps a prayer murmured in Latin or vernacular, a cross drawn in the air, a glance toward the family crucifix, if one could afford such a thing, there was still a deep sense of solemnity about bedtime. And it is also worth noting that in these rural settings, where candle wax was dear and light scarce, the hours of night were longer and segmented sleep more common, with villagers often sleeping in two phases. The first sleep beginning after dusk, broken by a period of wakefulness in the deep night, and then followed by a second sleep before dawn. And during that middle wakefulness, some might pray, some might tend a crying child or stoke the fire, and some might simply lie still, staring at the roof beams, letting the thoughts come and go. And during the plague years, that interval of wakefulness often became a time for reflection, confession, even silent mourning, especially if someone in the household had recently died or was showing signs of illness. And the silence of the countryside amplified all inner voices, all creaks in the wood, all gusts outside the shutter. And thus, the night, though it belonged to sleep, also belonged to worry, and to the quiet resilience of people who understood that rest was not always restful, but sometimes simply a pause. And even as rumors of mass graves in distant cities drifted into these rural communities, tales carried by peddlers or friars, or fleeing relatives, there was often a strange distance between what was heard and what was felt, as though the horror of plague belonged to the outside world until it did not, until one's own uncle or mother or daughter fell ill. And then sleep became a vigil, a long watch between breaths, and in such cases, people began to fear sleep itself, not because it was unpleasant, but because it might be the final thing, the last act. And so they clung to the light, to each other, to prayers, to any pattern of normalcy that might hold back the chaos. And even those who remained healthy found their sleep tinged with guilt, wondering why they had been spared. And when a neighbor died, it was not only the funeral that disrupted the rhythm of rural life, but also the sense that each bed now carried its own ghost, its own potential vacancy. And so people began to sleep more lightly, more cautiously, attuned to every cough, every movement, every shift in the breathing of those nearby. And some turned to charms, herbs, amulets hung over the bedposts, hoping to ward off the invisible, while others retreated into stoic acceptance, believing fate to be unchangeable, and thus sleep, that most intimate and vulnerable act, became a kind of gamble, a nightly leap into uncertainty. And for children, the plague years left memories of lullabies sung with tears, of mothers who held them longer than usual, of fathers who rose in the middle of the night to check their temperatures or whisper a blessing. And for the elderly, each night felt like a quiet curtain call, a moment to reflect on a life lived, unsure whether dawn would return. And in this way, the rural nightscape during the Black Death was a tapestry of hushed resilience, where sleep continued not because fear vanished, but because the body required it, and the soul hoped for it. And even the birds, whose cries heralded the morning, sounded sweeter for their predictability. And while many rural communities eventually endured the worst of the plague, losing 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 of their people, those who remained carried the memory of those silent nights, those shared beds, those prayers said in the dark, and long after the plague had passed, long after the fields had been replanted and the births had begun to outnumber the deaths. The habits of those years lingered: bedtime, prayers uttered with more reverence, family beds kept together for comfort, herbs dried and stored above the hearth, not only for healing, but for peace of mind. And so, in this quiet corner of history, among the hedgerows and cart paths and distant hills, the story of sleep during the Black Death was not one of constant terror or chaos, but of a quiet, persistent hope that each night might bring rest, and each morning might bring another day to live. And though no one could control who the plague would take, each person could still choose how to close their eyes at night, how to draw the blankets up, how to wait for morning. And that choice, humble as it was, became its own kind of defiance, a whisper against the scream, a candle against the dark. To continue understanding how people truly slept during the long and dismal nights of the Black Death, we must move now into the heart of the countryside, far from the dense urban centers where disease spread like flame over dry straw, and into the quieter, though no less haunted, world of the rural village, those small, isolated communities where peasants lived close to the land, tethered to the rhythms of the soil, the weather, the seasons, and now, inevitably, the patterns of death. And it is in this quieter and slower moving world that we begin to see how the rituals and expectations around sleep began to adapt in response to the gnawing anxiety of a world no longer predictable, where even the comforting regularity of the sun's rise and fall could not guarantee the continuity of family, health, or harvest. And so, as night approached in these rustic settings, often without the structured protections that even the poorest of city dwellers might access, no infirmary, no friar's bell, no physician, no warning from an overworked parish priest, sleep took on a different character, less of a daily rest and more of a cautious surrender to the darkness. And it is within these wooden cottages, with their low ceilings, packed dirt floors, and straw bedding, where livestock might sleep just inches away from their human counterparts, and where generations huddled together on pallets, bench beds, or even next to the hearth, if one was lucky, that we must imagine the toll that the plague exacted, not just on the body, but on the most basic human need, the need to rest, to fall asleep with a sense of safety, to allow the breath to slow without fear that the final breath might come silently in the night. And so they lay down, often in silence, often after long prayers whispered in Latin or in the rustic dialects of the fields, asking for the intercession of saints, of the Virgin Mary, of any power that might protect the children, the elderly, the harvest. And even though most had no knowledge of germs or fleas or the science of contagion, there existed a deep folk wisdom that sickness had a way of traveling, sometimes on the wind, sometimes in cursed water, sometimes carried by bad spirits or the gaze of an ill-meaning stranger. And thus sleep became not just a risk, but a moral and spiritual trial, for to sleep without saying one's prayers, to sleep without forgiving the day's slights, or without confessing even in one's heart, was to risk dying unshriven, unblessed, unprepared for the soul's long journey. And so many slept restlessly, not from the bite of the fleas alone, but from the burden of the unknown, from the persistent ache of fear tucked into the hay of every mattress. In these rural communities, though smaller and slower to be reached by plague than the cities, often felt its arrival more acutely when it did come, for they lacked not only doctors but grave diggers, not only herbalists but wood for coffins, and it was not uncommon during the worst seasons for entire hamlets to go silent, their chimneys smoking no more, their paths overgrown, their doorways collapsed under the weight of time and neglect. And those who remained, often the very old or the very stubborn, learned to sleep in a kind of half-conscious state, alert to the smallest cough, the faintest moan, or the sudden silence from the other side of the bed, and they began to interpret dreams not as idle amusements, but as warnings, as messages from beyond. For in times of plague, even the smallest sign could carry great weight. And if someone dreamed of a weeping child, or a black dog, or a stranger knocking at the door, it was whispered that death might be coming within the week. And so sleep itself became not just risky, but fraught with meaning, as if the night was a veil between worlds where spirits might pass freely and omens might be delivered by moonlight. And even in this quiet countryside life, where people were used to hardship and scarcity, the Black Death reshaped the very culture of bedtime, turning lullabies into prayers, bedtime stories into tales of martyrdom and miracle, and even the act of tucking in a child became a ritual of protection, sometimes with herbs placed beneath pillows, sometimes with signs of the cross drawn on foreheads. And in this way, rural, medieval sleep under the shadow of the plague was at once deeply physical and deeply spiritual. And while it might seem at first that life was simpler, far from the cities, in truth, the sleep of the rural poor was just as troubled, just as haunted, though perhaps in different ways, shaped more by isolation than noise, more by silence than screams. And yet they too adapted. They too found ways to endure, developing folk remedies passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter, such as placing mugwort or valerian root under one's bedding to ease fever dreams, or sleeping with a blade of iron nearby to ward off evil spirits, or reciting certain psalms backwards, practice frowned upon by the church but still whispered about in the darker corners of village life, fanned, for those few who still had access to livestock, the gentle sound of a cow's breath or the shifting weight of a sheep nearby might offer a strange comfort, a kind of living warmth in a world gone cold. And though many villagers were illiterate, they had long memories and oral traditions. And so bedtime became a moment to recall not just prayers, but stories of resilience of saints who had survived plagues, of miracles granted to humble shepherds, of dreams that had warned of illness and allowed families to flee just in time. And so the culture of sleep, even in these humble cottages, was rich with meaning and deeply connected to both spiritual and practical life. And sometimes, even amid all the sorrow, there was a moment of peace, when the stars blinked quietly above the thatched roof, and the children, too tired to be afraid, slipped into dreams of better days, while the adults lay beside them, eyes open, listening to the night, trying to believe that they would wake to morning, that the next sunrise might bring good news. And though no one in these times could truly feel safe, some found a strange kind of strength in the very act of lying down each night, in the choice to sleep, not because it was safe, but because life had to continue, and because even the plague could not erase the rhythm of the earth, the turn seasons, the pull of sleep upon the weary body, okay? And so the people of the countryside, like their urban counterparts, found their own rituals, their own myths, their own patterns of resistance. And in that quiet resistance was a kind of dignity, a refusal to let fear strip away the last comforts of home, of rest, of sleep. And when they woke, if they woke, they began each day with fresh thanks. For in a time when even a single night's sleep could end in death, to wake was not just ordinary, it was extraordinary. And perhaps that is the most human detail of all. That, despite the horror, despite the fear, despite the absence of comfort or certainty or medical knowledge, people still sought sleep, still craved the soft hush of night, still lay down in the dark and hoped. And in that small, enduring hope, we see something powerful, the refusal to surrender completely, the ability to believe, even faintly, that the night could still hold rest, that the body could still heal, that dreams could still come. And so they slept, when and how they could, beside hearths and hay, beside siblings and animals, with prayers on their tongues and tears on their cheeks. And sleep, though broken and fragile, still remained. To imagine the silence of the bells during the Black Death, one must first imagine how ever-present they once were in the rhythm of daily life. Because in the medieval world, bells were not only tools of sound, they were voices of time itself, voices that told people when to wake, when to work, when to pray, when to rest, and when to mourn. And without them, the very structure of life seemed to falter, for bells were the heartbeat of the community, rising from towers and churches to mark not only the hours, but also the spirit of the people. And so, when the bells grew silent, the silence was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of time itself, breaking apart. Every morning, across towns and villages, bells had rung to call people to prayer, to remind them of their connection to God and to each other. And their sound had always been steady, familiar, a comfort as much as a command. But as the plague spread, the men who rang the bells began to die. The priests who ordered their ringing began to vanish. The communities that gathered beneath their sound began to thin, and gradually the ringing grew sporadic, hesitant, interrupted, until finally, in many places, it stopped altogether, and the silence of bells was not only heard, but felt deep within. As though the world itself had lost its voice, the silence struck hardest at moments of death, because bells had always rung to mark the passing of a soul, tolling slow and solemn to let the living know that one among them had gone. And so, when bells ceased to toll, deaths became lonelier, burials became quieter, grief became more isolated, because there was no longer that shared sound rising above rooftops to say, "Here's loss, here's mourning, here's the voice of the dead carried into the sky." And instead, the dead were buried in silence, their departure unmarked, their memory left without the resonance of the bell. Imagine standing in a village where once the sound of bells had carried across fields, echoing through valleys, heard by shepherds and plowmen, heard by mothers at their doorways, heard by children at play. And now those same fields, valleys, and streets held only wind, only bird calls, only the occasional cough, and in that absence, people felt the weight of their own fragility. For silence reminded them not only of death, but of abandonment, reminded them that the voices of their community were fading, that the structures that held life together were dissolving. The bells were also markers of festivals and joy, of marriages and celebrations, of Easter and Christmas. And so their silence meant not only grief, but also the loss of joy, because there were no longer peals of triumph, no longer sudden bursts of sound that filled people with gladness, only quiet, only stillness, only the constant hum of fear. And so the calendar itself, once marked by the ringing of bells, began to blur, with days losing their boundaries, time itself unraveling into a gray sameness, as if history had fallen asleep. Consider also the symbolic power of bells, for in the medieval mind, their sound was not simply physical, but spiritual. Their ringing was thought to drive away storms, to chase away demons, to keep away misfortune. And when the bells fell silent, people felt exposed, vulnerable, unprotected, as though the shield of their community had been lifted, as though unseen forces could now approach unchecked. And in this sense, silence was not only emptiness, but danger, not only loss, but terror. Because in a world where faith was the shield against the plague, the absence of bells felt like the absence of God himself. For those who had grown up with bells as part of every rhythm of life, the sudden lack of sound disoriented the mind, made people lose track of time, lose track of prayer, lose track of their sense of belonging, because bells had always tied the individual to the collective, the earthly to the divine. And without them, people drifted, each alone in their own fear, each alone in their own grief, and the sense of being part of something greater shrank into the sense of being left alone, in silence. Yet the silence was not absolute everywhere, because in some places, priests tried to keep the bells ringing as long as possible, though each toll became a grim marker of yet another death. And in those towns where bells continued, the sound became unbearable, a constant tolling that reminded people endlessly of loss, until the ringing itself became associated not with God, but with despair. And so the few bells that continued to toll often inspired dread rather than comfort, driving some to wish for silence rather than endless sound of mourning. Thus, the silence of bells had two faces. One where the absence felt like abandonment, another where the presence felt like too heavy a burden. In both faces marked the way plague reshaped sound, reshaped meaning, reshaped the very sense of hearing. To understand how deep this transformation ran, one must imagine that in medieval Europe, silence was rare, for even in the countryside, there were always bells, always animals, always travelers, always markets, always human presence. And so, the new silence was not simply the absence of bells, but the absence of life that the bells had represented. And the memory of this silence became etched into survivors, who later told their children and grandchildren, not only of the sickness, but of the way the world fell quiet, the way time itself seemed to stop, the way the bells no longer rang. In monasteries, where bells had once ordered the day with perfect regularity, calling monks to prayer 7 times daily, the silence was even more haunting, because when half the monks died, when the others fled or fell ill, there was no one left to ring the hours, no one left to chant at matins, no one left to sound the call of vespers. And so the silence of bells inside those cloisters felt like the silence of God's voice, like a breaking of the covenant, like a void where once had been certainty. And yet, just as the vanished caravans had taught resilience, so too did the silent bells, because in their absence, people learned to find rhythm in other ways, learned to keep prayer by the sun, learned to mark grief by memory rather than sound, learned to continue even when the old voices of the towers had vanished. And though this was painful, it was also a form of endurance, because the silence forced people to hold the rhythm within themselves rather than rely upon the ringing outside. Still, when the plague finally weakened and life began slowly to return, the first bells to ring again were remembered with tears, with relief, with overwhelming emotion, because the sound meant more than the end of silence. It meant the return of order, the return of time, the return of God's presence, the return of community. And survivors often described the first ringing bells they heard as the sweetest sound of their lives, sweeter even than song, because it meant survival. It meant renewal. It meant that the silence had ended. And so, when we think of the plague, we must not only think of the dead and the sick, but also of the soundscape it destroyed, the way bells fell silent. The way silence itself became another form of suffering, another mark of devastation, another wound carved into the memory of the age. For the silent bells remind us that loss is not only seen but heard, not only physical but spiritual, not only counted in bodies but counted in the absence of voices, and that sometimes the deepest mark of catastrophe is not the sound of grief, but the silence that follows it, a silence heavy enough to change the soul of a world. In the stillness of an August night, under the weight of too many days marked by grief and too many nights wrapped in uneasy dreams, the world of the 14th century moved forward one breath at a time, slower than before, more tentative than it had ever dared to be, and as another sun set behind the worn silhouettes of plague-ridden towns, there were yet those whose lives continued on the margins, not untouched by death, but not yet taken by it either, suspended in that strange, somber middle space where the rhythm of ordinary life had not stopped completely, but had been reshaped, refigured, and softened into something far more fragile, something less certain and more observant of the darkness. And it was in these long, hesitant evenings, especially in rural hamlets and village outskirts, where one might find a kind of sleep that was not rest, but retreat, not healing, but hiding, as if lying still beneath straw and wool in the low creek of thatched ceilings might shield the mind from the world unraveling just beyond the door. For in truth, by the 11th month of the pestilence's grip, people had become experts not in hope, but in endurance, learning to endure sounds they once feared, the tolling of a bell, the distant cry of a mourner, the soft clatter of wheels. That meant the dead were being carried away yet again. This endurance showed itself most clearly in how they slept, or more accurately, how they tried to sleep when sleep was not easy to find. For even in the quiet of a remote farmstead, where no plague cart had yet arrived, and no physician's bird-masked silhouette had been glimpsed, the air itself seemed to murmur with unease, and as evening descended, it was common for families to gather around what little warmth they had left, not just fire, but presence, the breathing, beating presence of one another, before slowly, wordlessly retreating into their allotted sleeping spaces, which were often not rooms, but corners, shared spaces within the single-room structure of many peasant homes, where siblings and cousins lay pressed together beneath coarse blankets. And even though most villagers had long been used to sharing beds, now it was different. Now there was a silent accounting of each cough and shiver, a small prayer against every night's sweat, and whispered reassurance in the dark that the worst had not yet reached their door. And even when the plague had not yet touched their family, its looming threat turned every sleep into a sort of vigil, with the eldest often staying up long past the others, pretending to stoke the fire or keep watch over the goats, but in truth listening for the hush of death's arrival, which always seemed to come quietly, not in the dramatic thunder of storms or fire, but in the slow failing of breath, the stillness of morning when one body did not rise with the others. And so, in these times, dreams too changed, but when the world outside one's home teetered into nightmare, the sleeping mind could not help but echo the strain, and many spoke of dreams that felt more vivid, more weighted, with visits from lost relatives or visions of saints and demons alike. And often these dreams were discussed in the mornings in hushed tones over sparse bowls of pottage, as if speaking them too loudly might make them come true. And still others reported no dreams at all, as though their minds, overloaded with waking dread, could not summon any further images in the dark, and so they drifted in and out of shallow, broken sleep that left them more tired upon waking than they had been the night before. While some clung to ritual, saying certain prayers, lighting a taper, laying a charm near the bed, others turned to superstition in earnest, placing sprigs of dried rosemary under pillows or sleeping with a knife under the mattress to ward off the devil. And in wealthier households, the routines were only slightly more elaborate. with bedchambers sometimes fumigated with juniper smoke or washed down with vinegar before sleep, though these actions did little to prevent illness and much to soothe the mind, for by now most people understood, even if they could not say it aloud, that cleanliness and rituals were but illusions of control, and what truly determined who would wake the next day and who would not remained a mystery as cold and silent as the grave. And yet, night after night, they lay down again, wrapped in hope that perhaps their door would be passed over, that their family would remain intact a while longer. And as the nights stretched on into winter, the tone of sleep shifted again, now marked by the cold. For many could not afford firewood or candles, and so they huddled tightly for warmth. Entire households, curled like spoons in a single bed, with grandparents on one end and toddlers on the other. And it was not uncommon to wake with a limb numb or a blanket missing, or a child gone wandered off in fever, or stolen by a fate no one could name. And there was something uniquely tragic about these winter nights, not because they were worse than the others, but because they seemed to stretch longer, the darkness hanging heavier and the silence growing deeper. And with the fields now frozen and the roads often impassable, travelers no longer came with news, and so isolation compounded fear, and fear compounded fatigue, and fatigue became a kind of sleepwalking state in which many passed their days, barely registering time's passage, except by the moon's position or the hunger in their stomachs. And still they lay down, night after night, sometimes sleeping, sometimes not, but always closing their eyes with a mix of dread and exhaustion, unsure if the dreams would come, or if they would be dreams at all, or simply another chapter in the long, slow end of things. And what makes this part of history so striking is not the fear or the death, though both were immense, but the way people continued to sleep, continued to try, continued to make pallets of straw and soften their children's heads with worn cloth, continued to whisper prayers into the shadows and mark time by the rooster's crow, continued to lay down beside each other, not knowing if they would all rise again. In this continuity, this choice to sleep despite uncertainty speaks to something deeply human, something quietly resilient, for even when the world seemed broken beyond recognition, the simple act of closing one's eyes and seeking rest remained, if not a comfort, then at least a habit. And in many ways, it was this habit that carried people through, from one dark day to the next, from one generation to another. For even though the plague left scars across the land in empty towns and reshaped the very structures of society, sleep persisted as an act of defiance, an act of renewal. And even as the winds howled outside crumbling walls and the stars looked down upon a Europe changed forever, there were still those who, beneath rough blankets and flickering candlelight, dared to dream, dared to hope that perhaps the worst was passing, dared to rest in a world that had so little rest to offer. And in that act, there was a quiet kind of survival, not loud or noble or triumphant, but real all the same. And so it was that as the 11th chapter of this long dark night unfolded, people still lay their heads upon whatever passed for a pillow, shut their eyes against the smoke and the sorrow, and sought what sleep they could in a time that had forgotten peace, but not yet forgotten the shape of dreaming. If you were to drift quietly into a candlelit chamber somewhere in the waning years of the 14th century, long after the worst waves of the Black Death had passed, but while its shadow still lingered over the lives of those who survived, you would notice that sleep, though never absent, had grown into something layered with caution, its ritual and residual sorrow. And this chapter turns its gaze to the psychological toll that the plague had etched into the soul of medieval sleepers. Because once the disease had receded from its terrifying peak, it didn't take its memories with it, nor did it return the serenity of night to those who had once lost everyone they loved before the sunrise came. And in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, when the streets lay still and only the wind murmured through half-empty villages, The minds of the living wandered down pathways carved by loss, by guilt, and by the aching pull of memory. And so it was that the very act of going to bed became something subtly haunted, a nightly walk through old fears where pillows could become reminders of who once slept beside you in hearths, a place where laughter no longer echoed, and in a time when mental health had no language, when dreams and visions were interpreted through the lens of sin or divine judgment. The trauma of living through the plague carved out deep hollows in the minds of survivors, hollows they carried into bed with them like invisible satchels full of stones. And it's important to pause here and understand that the human mind, like the body, needs a sense of safety in order to fall into rest. But when the world no longer felt safe, when death had crept into homes as silently as a breeze and left bodies behind before the second sleep could begin, the ability to truly let go into slumber was often compromised, sometimes indefinitely. And though they did not have our modern terms for post-traumatic stress, insomnia, or survivor's guilt, these people lived with the symptoms of all three, and more, carrying them into their resting rituals, their whispered prayers, their clenched jaws in the dark, and their refusal to put out the candle, even after the house was locked tight. For many believed that leaving a light burning could help ward off spirits, or, more superstitiously, keep the plague vapors from curling back under the door. And even though the scientific understanding of contagion was still deeply flawed and rooted more in miasma theory than microbial reality, there remained a potent association between stillness, darkness, and vulnerability, as though sleep itself could be an invitation to death if one was not careful. And for some, especially those who had narrowly escaped death or had nursed dying family members, the bedroom was no longer a neutral space, but one infused with painful associations. The smell of vinegar used to wipe down infected linens, the sight of a loved one slipping away under the covers, the quiet terror of waiting to see if their own symptoms would come in the night. And over time, these mental scars did not vanish, but became part of the nightly ritual, shaping how people approached rest. And it was not uncommon for survivors to begin engaging in more fervent forms of nighttime prayer, to leave offerings near the bed, or to sleep with protective amulets sewn into the hems of their nightclothes, hoping not just for physical protection, but for mental peace. And the church, which had been shaken and divided by the plague years, offered limited comfort in this regard. For while some priests preached consolation and endurance, others insisted that suffering was punishment for communal sin, and thus some sleepers internalized the idea that their continued survival was undeserved or temporary, which added a subtle layer of guilt or dread to every evening. And even as communities rebuilt, even as new marriages were formed and children were born to replace those lost, there remained in the older generations a particular stiffness, a weariness that crept into their bones and made its way into the way they tucked themselves into bed, as if each night could still carry a finality. And among the aging and the grief-stricken, dreams themselves took on heightened significance, and were recorded in diaries and recounted in hushed tones at market stalls. For dreams of the dead were common and believed by many to be visitations, warnings, or messages from beyond, and thus a person who dreamed of a deceased spouse, child, or neighbor might carry that vision with them for days, trying to interpret its meaning, or fearing that it foretold their own impending death. And while such dream accounts can be found in chronicles and religious writings of the time, they reveal not just a society obsessed with signs, but one deeply affected by unresolved grief, and this grief, left to fester without the vocabulary of therapy or the release of widespread mourning rituals, many of which had been abandoned or truncated due to the overwhelming number of deaths often manifested in sleep, both as a scarcity and a source of distress. And among the peasantry, who lacked the distractions or luxuries available to wealthier survivors, the weight of memory was sometimes too much to bear. leading to patterns of restlessness, chronic fatigue, or even self-imposed wakefulness. One would sit by the hearth for long hours rather than face the bed alone. And yet, life insisted on continuing. Crops had to be sown, animals tended, markets reopened, and even among the worst of sleepers, there came a kind of acceptance, a hardened adaptation, where the act of sleeping became one of many necessary routines, stripped of comfort but maintained for survival. And as time wore on, children who had grown up in plague years reached adulthood with dim memories of what had happened, often shaped more by the silence of their elders than by detailed accounts. And these children, inheriting the shadows of fear, but not always the facts, began to ask questions in the dark about the people whose names they saw scratched into old prayer books or etched on headstones overgrown with moss. And their curiosity, coupled with the community's hesitance to speak of the worst years, created a kind of generational gap where fear remained, but its source grew diffuse, almost mythical. And yet, this lingering dread still shaped how sleep was approached through rituals inherited without explanation. Like always, crossing oneself 3 times before bed, or never sleeping with your feet facing the door, or keeping a sprig of rosemary under the pillow to ward off the bad humors, and such practices, passed down from mother to daughter or grandfather to grandson, became threads in a tapestry of sleep interwoven with superstition, half-memory, and a desire for protection in a world where safety was never guaranteed. And as physicians slowly gained ground, as public health ordinances began to emerge in cities, and as medicine inched toward a more empirical future, the emotional residue of the plague years persisted far longer than the miasmas ever had, influencing how people viewed illness, sleep, dreams, and death well into the Renaissance. And even artists, poets, and chroniclers of the later centuries will look back upon the plague years with a mixture of horror and fascination, often emphasizing the psychological unraveling of the population as much as the physical toll. And sleep, such a quiet, natural act, was never quite the same again. For even when peace returned, when bells rang for weddings instead of funerals, and when children laughed again in the streets, the night still belonged to memory, and to a generation who had once believed they might not live to see another sunrise. And though history tends to look forward, it is in the stillness of sleep that the past often whispers loudest, and the people of the post-plague world, carrying their burdens silently beneath woolen blankets and beside dwindling hearts, remind us that healing is slow, that the soul takes longer to recover than the body, and that sleep, while universal, is always shaped by what we've endured. The plague had reshaped the world in ways no king, no pope, no war, and no famine alone could ever achieve. And as the final waves of pestilence receded, leaving behind lands scarred by death, villages thinned of their people, monasteries weakened, markets disrupted, and families broken, survivors faced not only the burden of grief, but also the staggering weight of rebuilding. For when the silence of empty fields, hollowed towns, abandoned homes began to fade into the steady hum of returning life, it became clear that though the Black Death had ended, its shadow would stretch across centuries, reshaping memory, belief, labor, culture, and the very imagination of what it meant to live in the world. And the survivors of that dark age were both haunted and transformed, carrying forward not only the scars of loss, but also the seeds of change that would alter the trajectory of Europe forever. People looked at the earth with new eyes, for where once they had trusted in the cycles of harvests, in the regularity of seasons, in the rhythms of life bound to church bells and agricultural toil, now they knew how fragile it all was, how easily death could sweep across continents, how thin the thread of survival truly was, and that knowledge made them both fearful and bold. Fearful because faith in stability was broken, bold because the collapse of old certainties opened space for new. experiments in thought, in art, in society, and in the very structure of human relations. Entire villages, once bound tightly to lords, began to slip free, because when half or more of the tenants were dead, the manor could not function as before, and so peasants demanded freedom, demanded wages, demanded terms, and, though rulers passed harsh laws to freeze wages, to bind peasants, to restore the world to what it had been, the attempt was like trying to dam a river already in flood, because scarcity of labor was a fact no decree could erase. And so, over time, feudal bonds cracked, slowly but decisively, as survivors moved to towns, joined trades, sought better lords, or simply took abandoned lands, and this shift, born of the plague's devastation, helped to loosen the feudal world and point society toward a more flexible, mobile, and eventually modern order. Cities, too, changed. For the plague had not only emptied them, but had also revealed their vulnerabilities, the closeness of people, the dirt, the waste, the crowded markets where death had spread so quickly, and so survivors began to think differently about space, about health, about the ordering of streets and markets, laying distant seeds for public health. Though, in the immediate aftermath, fear and suspicion often dominated, with some communities expelling strangers, others building new walls, others clinging to rituals of cleansing, but all carried forward the lesson that the urban world, so vital to commerce and culture, was also fragile in the face of unseen enemies. Faith, shaken but not destroyed, turned inward and outward in different ways. For some survivors clung to God more tightly than ever, seeing in the plague a punishment, a test, a trial, while others turned skeptical, questioning the power of priests, the rituals of indulgence, the wealth of the church that had failed to protect them. And in that questioning lay the roots of later reform, because when so many had prayed and still so many had died, some began to wonder if the church truly held the keys to salvation, and if perhaps faith must be more personal, more direct, and more critical of earthly authority. And so, in the centuries that followed, the Reformation would find ready ground, nourished by memories of plague and failure. Art, too, bore the mark of the Black Death, for the survivors painted, carved, and wrote not only of saints and heavens, but also of skulls, skeletons, dances of death, processions where the living and the dead mingled, reminders that death was never far, and yet within that grim imagery also blossomed a deeper awareness of life's fragility, a sharper sense of beauty, of fleeting moments, of earthly pleasures that must be savored before they vanish. And in this heightened awareness of mortality, art gained a new intensity, preparing the way for the flowering of the Renaissance, when human creativity, sharpened by grief and survival, exploded into works that still stand as some of humanity's greatest achievements. Economies shifted in strange ways, for though plague had destroyed lives, it also redistributed wealth, leaving survivors sometimes richer, inheriting lands, tools, and goods from the dead. And this sudden change of fortune empowered some who had once been poor, while destabilizing lords who had relied on the obedience of the many. And though the suffering was immeasurable, out of it grew a new social fluidity, a chance for movement, a chance for ambition. And so markets, though disrupted, at first eventually rebounded with vigor, fueled by people who had seen the world collapse and knew it could be remade. And memory itself became a force, for the plague lived on not only in bodies, but in stories, in chronicles, in sermons, in whispered tales. And these memories shaped generations, teaching children who had never known the Black Death that the world was dangerous, that God's will was mysterious, that life was fragile, but also that survival was possible, that humanity could endure, that after death came rebuilding. And so memory became both a warning and a source of resilience, binding together the living and the dead in a shared story of catastrophe and endurance. In the end, the Black Death was not only a tragedy, but also a turning point. Not only an end, but also a beginning, for it showed the fragility of all human systems, while also revealing their capacity for renewal. It broke the bonds of feudalism, while sowing the seeds of wage labor. It shattered unquestioned faith, while preparing the way for reform. It scarred art with death, while fertilizing the imagination with new vitality. And in its devastation, it cleared space for rebirth. The survivors did not know they stood at the threshold of modernity. They only knew they must plant again, build again, pray again, love again, and in doing so, carried forward a world transformed, not by choice, but by necessity, not by vision, but by survival. And from their weary hands and hopeful hearts grew to Europe that would one day explore, form, create, and change the course of global history. The Black Death had been the darkest of nights, but even the darkest night ends. And dawn, fragile yet real, always follows, and in that dawn, humanity walked forward, scarred but alive, burdened but resilient, haunted by shadows, yet drawn by light. And that is the legacy of the plague, a reminder that even in the face of silence, despair, and unimaginable loss, the story does not end with death, but with survival, adaptation, and the stubborn, unquenchable will to live. As the world outside fell into a quieter, darker chapter in the wake of the Black Death, there emerged a profound sense that time itself had begun to drift like fog through a still and forsaken valley, where the hours bled softly into one another, and where life once marked by rhythms of church bells, bustling markets, and laughter was now paced by silence, solitude, and the heavy, slow cadence of mourning. And so it was that the very concept of night and sleep took on a deeper, almost sacred quality, not merely as rest for the weary, but as a kind of retreat, as a soft descent into a private world where the fears of the plague and the grief of loss could be momentarily laid down like burdens at the foot of an unseen altar. And in this final chapter, we must now close our eyes gently upon this sorrowful but stirring tapestry of medieval existence and drift fully into the sleeping chambers, not of royalty or clergy or laborer alone, but of all souls touched by the quiet shadow of that harrowing century. For even in the darkest corners of pestilence and panic, humans still yearned for the comfort of blankets, the hush of lullabies, and the warmth of memory in the places where sleep held sway. And so we imagine one last home, one final hearth where sleep awaited with outstretched arms, not as a surrender, but as a ritual, and perhaps a fragile hope. And perhaps it is in this moment we understand more deeply than ever how integral sleep was to the experience of enduring plague, not just physically, but spiritually, emotionally, and socially, because the plague made sleep both a necessity and a fearsome luxury. And even while danger crept through the streets like a phantom with a bell, people still arranged their beds with care, laid their children down with whispered prayers, tucked woolen blankets over trembling bodies, and waited, breath slow, hearts fragile, hoping for morning to come. And what a strange, haunting hope it was, for many, morning did come, with sun filtering through wooden shutters, lighting the dust on old floorboards, coaxing birdsong back into ears, still weary from night terrors and unspoken thoughts. And for others, morning came only in the silence that followed a stillness to complete, the beds left unshaken, and the fire untended. And yet, these endings, quiet though they were, did not erase the human rituals that surrounded them, because for every room left cold, there was another where someone woke and reached for water, stretched beneath linen sheets, sighed into the pillow with a strange gratitude, and the cycle began again. And so we think of the chambers themselves, the rooms where people slept, some grand and timber-framed, with carved headboards and embroidered coverlets, others bare and humble, with straw ticks and rough wool cloaks thrown over shoulders. And yet, in all of them, regardless of wealth or station, the night brought both the terror of dreams and the miracle of rest. For sleep was not only something people needed, was something they tended to, like a garden in the dark. And perhaps nowhere was this clearer than in the communal spaces of sleep, for in convents, in monasteries, in almshouses and hostels, people lay side by side, breathing the same air, listening to the same wind rustling through the trees beyond the walls, and even in such closeness, there was loneliness. For each sleeper drifted into their own world, their own memories, their own silent reckonings, and perhaps this is why lullabies continue to be sung in plague years. Simple melodies passed from mother to child, from elder to orphan. Notes that held not just comfort, but resistance, as if to say yes, the world outside is broken, but here, in this moment, in this room, in this song, there is still peace to be found. And if sleep became a kind of haven, then so too did dreams become messengers, bringing visions of distant pastures, of departed loved ones, of angels and omens, of warmth and light, and things yet to be healed. And the people of the 14th century believed in dreams deeply, consulted them, feared them, cherished them, especially when waking life offered so little certainty. And it is a quiet truth that dreams, though wordless and fleeting, offered a sense of connection to the unseen, to the divine, to hope. And so it is no surprise that many documented visions during this time were born in the silence of sleep, chronicled in the margins of psalters, in personal prayer books, in the stories passed from neighbor to neighbor, whispered at dawn, overshared, read or recounted to confessors who nodded slowly, seeing in each tale a soul's struggle to find footing in a shifting world, and thus, in ways subtle and immense, sleep during the Black Death was not only rested, was defiance, was memory, it was healing, and it was a last whisper of normalcy in a world that had lost its balance. And as we reflect now on the final images of those days and nights, let us imagine one last lantern flickering in a narrow window, one last mother adjusting the woolen cap on her sleeping child, one last monk kneeling in candlelight before resting on a stone pallet, one last villager pulling a blanket tighter around shoulders worn from labor and grief. And we can feel that, even in the worst of times, people continue to seek comfort, continue to make space for peace, continue to allow sleep to carry them into gentler places, even if only for a few hours. And though we have walked through heavy halls and listened to sorrowful echoes in this journey, we end with the softest of sounds, the rustling of linen, the distant chirp of night birds, the hush of a prayer barely audible beneath breath, and the slow, steady heartbeat of a soul settling into rest. And it is here, in this quiet moment between the sigh and the dream, that we recognize the unbreakable human will to find stillness, to seek quietude, to hope even in darkness. And so we too now allow ourselves to settle, to breathe a little slower, to feel the weight of centuries ease from our shoulders like a cloak gently laid aside. And with that, dear listener, we say thank you for walking so softly through this story with us, for listening, for pausing, for remembering that even in times of fear, there was gentleness. And now, as the candle fades and the shadows stretch long across the floorboards, may you too find your own place of rest, your own comfort, your own dream, and may it carry you safely through the night.